Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13. Hello and welcome to episode 20 of It's Murder Up North. This will be part 1 of a two-parter, as I wanted to do justice to this notorious killer's overlooked victims, with part 2 covering the crime that made him infamous and more details on the killer. Until I was 8, I lived in the town of Accrington, an old cotton town in the northwest of England. I used to play on Buller Park, which occupied several acres and consisted of a play park, fields, tennis courts and woodland trails. I remember older children telling tales of a man clad in black carrying a gun who would hide in the woods. These are the usual stories told to scare young children and keep them away from the secluded areas. And when you're young, you believe everything you're told. Now I'm older, I know that some of the tales weren't true. However, there was truth in this tale. For in the 1970s, the town was haunted by the spectre of a gunman, clad all in black. Before I head to the episode, I just want to say thank you to my latest Patreon supporter, Michael. Your support is greatly appreciated, and thank you so much for the case suggestion. It's definitely one I hope to bring to the podcast soon. My listeners are what keep this podcast going. Just by listening, reviewing and spreading the word, you are helping the show to grow, and for that I am eternally grateful. Just a quick shout out for my podcast of the week. Please join Cassie and Tiffany at Happy Hour Gets Weird. If you want something a little different, they are definitely worth a listen. Here is a taste of their show.
Hi, I'm Cassie.
I'm Tiffany.
And we're the hosts of Happy Hour Gets Weird.
On our podcast, we talk all things weird,
Like UFOs,
Bigfoot,
astrology,
ghosts,
and even true crime.
and every episode, we create a fabulous new cocktail.
So fabulous. If you're looking for a little weirdness, please search Happy Hour Gets Weird on your favorite podcast platform.
Cheers to that.
Cheers to that.
Now, let's head to the episode. The postal service was once solely reserved for the use of the king and his court. However, in 1635, King Charles I introduced a public mail service for letters to be carried from one post to the next post by carriers on foot or on horseback. Letters sent through the public postal service could only travel via 6 designated roads. These ran from London, Dover, Plymouth, Edinburgh, Bristol and Yarmouth. Postal carriers travelled by night and day, meaning a letter could travel 120 miles in just 24 hours. The life of a postal carrier was harsh and filled with danger. They were not paid well, which led some to steal from the post they were meant to deliver. The roads they travelled were nothing more than dirt tracks, well worn and treacherous under the hooves of their steeds. These roads were unlit and would cross great expanses of isolated countryside, and as the couriers had to adhere to the designated routes, they were easy targets for highwaymen whose main aim was to steal the post, but would resort to injuring or even killing the courier in the process. The mail deliveries were made safer when the post was transported by coaches guarded by armed men, and in 1772 a change in the law meant that being armed and disguised on a highway or in the open countryside became punishable by death. The decline in highway robberies was also due to the introduction of highway patrols that would traverse the postal routes. Landlords of inns and taverns along the highways were punished for providing sanctuary to the highway robbers, and the growth of banking meant that people did not need to travel with excessive amounts of money, making the reward not worth the risk. The last highway robbery was believed to have occurred in England in 1831, but that didn't stop thefts from the postal service. When the post began to be transported by the train, it led to audacious robberies such as the infamous 1963 Great Train Robbery, in which a gang of 15 halted the overnight mail train and got away with £2.6 million, which is roughly £55 million in today's money. By the 1960s, there was approximately 25,000 post offices in the UK, handling letters, parcels and money. Due to the often rural locations of these branches and the limited security that was in place compared to a bank, they became easy targets for robberies. Beginning in 1967, post offices in Nottingham, Lancashire and Yorkshire had been targeted by an unknown culprit. In the span of 7 years, a total of 19 post offices had been raided by the elusive perpetrator. Substantial amounts of money were taken in these raids. In South Yorkshire alone, the suspect targeted 3 post offices in Barnsley and Rotherham, fleeing with £9,000, equivalent to roughly £137,000 today. Up until 1972, the post office raider had managed to avoid being seen. However, on the 16th of February, he targeted a post office in Heywood, Lancashire. The post office was positioned at the end of a row of terraced houses and was on the corner of the busy Rochdale Road East and Green Lane. The post office occupied the ground floor, and the postmaster, Leslie Richardson, lived in the flat above with his wife. Under the cover of darkness, a shadowy figure approached the rear of the property, removed a window frame with a drill without drawing any attention, and then the figure stealthily disappeared into the unlit property. Waking to find a hooded man dressed from head to toe in black standing at the doorway to their bedroom, Mr. Richardson rushed at the intruder and began to wrestle with the masked man. He was small in stature but surprisingly strong. As Leslie fought with the attacker, his wife called the police. It was at this point that the intruder, who drew a sawn-off shotgun from his sleeve and in a West Indian accent proclaimed, "This is loaded." Pointing the gun at the ceiling, he forced Mr. Richardson backwards, but unperturbed by this little man, the postmaster replied, "We'll find out if it's loaded," and grabbed hold of the gun, pulling the trigger himself and sending 2 bullets into the ceiling. Leslie Richardson was able to wrestle his assailant to the ground and remove the black hood that had concealed his face. The dark eyes staring back at him, however, were not those of a West Indian, but of a pale, dark-haired man. In his moment of hesitation, the sprightly attacker was able to force Leslie off him. Springing to his feet, the unmasked assailant mercilessly stepped on Mr. Richardson's feet, breaking several toes, before kicking him in the groin. Leslie writhed on the floor in pain, as the attacker fled out the rear of the property, moments before the police arrived. Despite getting a good look at the perpetrator, Leslie Richardson gave police a description of the man, which turned out to be very misleading, proving that eyewitness accounts are not always reliable, especially following such a terrifying attack. The post office raids continued, but the police were no closer to apprehending the perpetrator. With thousands of post offices in the UK, it was impossible for the police to know where he would strike next. The North Yorkshire town of Harrogate is synonymous with wealth, health and happiness. Often voted the happiest place to live in the UK, it is an elegant spa town, blessed with splendid architecture, on the edge of the beautiful Yorkshire Dales. It has long been a popular destination for tourists, and the home of the best tea in the world, Yorkshire tea. On February the 15th, 1974, this prosperous town was stunned by the death of a popular postmaster at his shop in the New Park area of the town. Just like the location of the post office run by Leslie Robertson, the store stood on Skipton Road, a busy route that led into the town centre. Donald and Johanna Skepper lived in a small flat above the shop with their 18-year-old son Richard. Their two eldest children had moved away. They were a hard-working and well-liked family and loved members of the community. That afternoon, Donald had been to choir practice at the local Methodist church, and upon his return home, the family enjoyed a meal to celebrate Johanna's birthday. The shop had been locked up for hours, the day's paperwork completed, and takings were placed securely in the safe. The postmaster's day would start early, and so, after the meal, the family retired to bed at about 11:15. In the early hours of that chilly February morning, a figure clad in black silently skulked up the staircase to where the family were sleeping. He entered the 18-year-old son's bedroom and nudged Richard Skepper awake with the barrel of a shotgun pointed in the boy's face. The hooded figure spoke in hushed tones, demanding the teenager tell him where the keys to the safe were. When the terrified boy told the intruder they were in a cupboard under the stairs, Richard was forced to lie on his front as his hands and feet were bound with rope and he was silenced with a piece of tape across his mouth. The boy lay in the darkness as the masked figure disappeared. He struggled to get loose from his bindings, listening intently in case the intruder returned. But all he could hear was the sound of the neighbour's dogs barking outside. The boy stopped struggling when the intruder returned, his small but intimidating frame eclipsing the doorway. The masked figure pulled out a small knife and paced threateningly towards the bed. Richard closed his eyes, fearing he was about to be assaulted, but instead, the assailant cut the bindings on Richard's ankles. He dragged Richard to his feet and insisted the boy show him where the keys were hidden. Clearly agitated, having not found the keys where the boy had claimed they should be, he forced Richard into his parents' bedroom to look for them. As the pair entered the bedroom, Donald and Johanna were woken by the shuffling of Richard's feet. And curious, they turned the light on to see what was going on, to be confronted with the sight of their son being held at gunpoint. The light only increased the masked intruder's aggression as he yelled at Donald to switch it off. Obediently, the postmaster reached towards the light switch. But then, instead of turning off the light, he leapt from the bed and lunged at the gun-wielding man, yelling, "Get him!" Before 54-year-old Donald Skepper was in 3 feet of the intruder, the gun was fired. The blast rang out and the loving father and husband crumpled to the floor. The attacker then fled, leaving the family in a state of shock. At 5:30 in the morning, the emergency services were summoned to the post office. Unfortunately, due to the low crime rate in Harrogate, there were routinely only 2, maybe 3 police officers on patrol in the area at the time, and tragically, Donald died in his wife's arms before help arrived. In the years that have followed Donald's death, his shop has been demolished, and in its place stands a garden erected in his memory. The garden now sits at a busy roundabout, which leads to Harrogate, Ripon or Skipton, meaning thousands of people unknowingly pass the site of this tragedy. Officers were drafted in from across Yorkshire to assist in the search for this violent perpetrator who dressed in black and wielded a shotgun. But just like the robbery 2 years earlier, the suspect had disappeared into the shadows. Detective Chief Superintendent Bill Dolby of North Yorkshire Police issued a stark warning to the public during a press conference.
This man is a man who is quite cold, utterly ruthless if he meets the slightest opposition. The man has no compunction about taking human life. Any member of the public who has any thoughts at all about having a go with this man, my advice to him is don't.
All went quiet for several months. The mysterious post office raider who had claimed the life of Donald Skepper still evaded police. And then the masked raider struck again in September 1975. This time in Baxenden, which lies on the outskirts of the town of Accrington. Incidentally, the crime occurred just a mile away from my childhood home. The post office where Derek Aston worked was on Manchester Road, opposite St John's Church. Just like Donald Skepper, Derek was self-employed and his shop was at the centre of the semi-rural community. He and his family lived in a flat above the shop. 43-year-old Derek Aston had served in the Royal Marines. He was married to Marion, and the couple had a 13-year-old daughter Susan and a 10-year-old son Stephen. The family had enjoyed their evening meal. The children were bathed and in bed ready for school in the morning. Derek sat in the dim light of a lamp in the office, finishing off the day's accounts. One by one the lights inside the home were extinguished as the family settled down for the night, unaware that in the darkness the property was being watched. At 4 a.m. Derek was woke with a jolt. He was sure he'd heard something downstairs, but after listening and hearing nothing, he tried to go back to sleep. He was just drifting off when Marion tapped him on the shoulder. She too had been awoken by a noise in the darkness. Warily, Derek moved across the room when out of the shadows by the wardrobe, a figure emerged. Marion rushed to help her husband as he began to struggle with the intruder. She handed him a small vacuum to use as a weapon, and the couple were able to force the intruder back onto the landing. Desperate to protect his family, Derek mustered all his strength to fight the masked figure, the noise awakening the sleeping children, as the wrestling pair crashed into walls and knocked pictures to the floor. The sleepy children opened their bedroom doors to see what the commotion was about, just as a loud bang erupted and their father cried out in pain. Despite being wounded, Derek continued to tussle with his attacker. He managed to fight him backwards to the top of the stairs, where the pair lost their footing and tumbled down the staircase. As they hit the bottom, another shot rang out, and like a phantom the perpetrator disappeared into the gloom. Marion raced to the phone, only to find the line dead. As she ran to her husband's side, her children fled to the neighbour's house to get help. They told them their daddy had been attacked by a man dressed all in black. Paramedics arrived and took the seriously injured postmaster to Blackburn Royal Infirmary. Marion had fought to stem the flow of blood from his wounds, but shortly after arriving at hospital, Derek Aston died. He had been shot twice, once in the shoulder with a shotgun, the pellets splintering to cause extensive internal bleeding, and once more in the back, where a .22 caliber bullet was recovered. Remarkably, Derek had his foot in a bandage at the time of the attack, due to him having his toe amputated. He must have been in unbelievable agony as he fought his killer, but the need to protect his loved ones overrode his pain. Following the incident, a search for the perpetrator was begun. Roadblocks were put in place, and every vehicle was stopped, the occupants questioned, and their vehicles searched. One of those who was held at the roadblock was my dad, who at the time was courting my mum, and was making the 68-mile journey to Kidsgrove to visit her. Over 60 police officers were drafted in, including dog handlers and firearms officers, who conducted a comprehensive search of the surrounding areas, including the park I used to play in as a child. Specialist forensic teams were brought in to analyse the crime scene, and an incident room was established at Accrington Police Station. to coordinate the operation. For the town of Accrington, this was an unprecedented incident. One of the policemen assigned to the case was newly promoted Detective Sergeant Jim Oldcorn. The retired officer provided an interview to the local press several years later. He recalled the murder as if it was yesterday. "I recollect it all vividly," he said. Derek was a well-liked and well-respected member of the community, and many of the policemen on the case knew him personally because they used to go into his shop. On that first morning, there was a feeling of sadness and outrage that this man had been killed in wicked circumstances. It reminds you how wicked and evil people can be. End quote. The investigation revealed that the perpetrator had gained entry through a window at the rear of the property by using a drill. This detail, along with the description of the attacker and the same bullets being recovered from both crime scenes, led police to link the incident to the murder of Donald Skepper 50 miles away in Harrogate. They also noted an evolution in the perpetrator's modus operandi, as he was now cutting the phone wire to prevent the residents summoning help. A local reporter interviewed Marian Aston shortly after the attack. The distraught widow described her husband's courageous actions and his final moments as she held his hand and bid him goodbye. She told the reporter that the killer was, quote, "so quick he was like a panther," referring to the fact that not only was the killer stealthy, but also that he was dressed from head to foot in black. This led the reporter to end his piece to camera with a question, quote, "Where is this Black Panther?" Detective Chief Superintendent Joe Monsey of Lancashire Police voiced his concerns regarding the attacker.
"This man is obviously a thinker. He's cold. And I think one can say that he's obviously ruthless. And the worry is, of course, that he may do it again."
The manhunt continued across Yorkshire and Lancashire. Police were unable to predict the master assailant's next target was to be a post office over 100 miles away in the Midlands. The picturesque village of Worley lies on the outskirts of Birmingham. At the heart of the community was its pillar-box red, double-aspect post office, run by postmistress Dorothy Grayland, known affectionately as Peggy, and her husband Sidney. Their shop was not just a post office, but a confectioner's and newsagent's, which made it a popular spot for locals of all ages. But it was its rural location, with excellent road links, that made it an ideal target for the masked robber. On the 11th of November 1974, it had been a typical day in the village shop, with the usual business to attend to, as well as a friendly chat here and there with the locals. As the evening drew in and the last few customers were served, the couple prepared to close for the night. Dorothy began the closing routine, ensuring the cash was counted and locked away in the safe, and the shop was clean and stocked. Realising they were running low on a few items, she asked Sidney to go to the storeroom. As her husband entered the storeroom at the rear of the shop, his attention was drawn to the strange scratching and knocking on the back door. Curious, Sidney opened the door abruptly, to be startled by the presence of a masked man wielding a torch who had been busy trying to break the lock, which seemed odd as seen as it was already unlocked. Sidney grabbed hold of the torch, and as he did so, a liquid sprayed out of a bottle which had been taped to it. The spray stung the robber's eyes, who stepped back in pain, but the wounded man was still a threat as he pulled out a gun and fired in the direction of Sidney Grayland, who was struck in the stomach by the shotgun pellets. With the attacker's eyes burning from the ammonia, he ripped off his balaclava. As his vision recovered, he observed Peggy Grayland, stood in shock at the doorway to the storeroom. Seeing her wounded husband, she instinctively rushed to his aid, realising that the postmistress had seen his face. The unmasked man with thick black hair, dark eyes and a chiselled jawline rushed to stop her. Peggy Grayland punched at the gunman, but he was too strong for her as he pushed her against a shelving unit, hitting her head in the process. He hit her head against the shelf 2 more times with such force that the wood splintered. Peggy slid to the floor, semi-conscious. As the violent attacker bound her hands with a metal wire, she drifted into unconsciousness. The shelf above her fell, burying her beneath the stop. The vicious criminal then calmly headed into the post office, where he collected nearly £1,000 in postal orders and cash. He returned to the stockroom. Seeing that Peggy was regaining consciousness, he struck her with the butt of his shotgun, causing the handle to splinter. And then he disappeared into the dark November night. 4 hours later, and 2 police officers on a routine patrol noticed the lights in the post office were still burning. Finding this unusual, they went to investigate and stumbled upon a gruesome scene. Sidney Grayland had already passed away. The bullet had ruptured his aorta and he had bled out, and Peggy was unconscious, with a very faint pulse. Mrs. Grayland was rushed to hospital. She had been brutally beaten, sustaining multiple injuries, including skull fractures. But it was clear she had put up a fight. She had defensive wounds on her arms, and had grabbed at the attacker's hands with such ferocity she had torn a tip of the assailant's black rubber glove, which meant as he fled, he left behind a fingerprint. Peggy Grayland was in the hospital for over a month before she was able to fully communicate with police. And despite the horrific attack and the severity of her injuries, she could distinctly recall the face of her attacker in great detail, helping the police to create the most accurate photo of it to date. Tragically, not only was Peggy notified that her husband had died in the attack, but while she had been in intensive care, her 45-year-old brother had passed away following a heart attack. It didn't take police long to link this robbery and murder to the one that had occurred in Harrogate and Maxenden. Knowing the culprit was a dangerous individual who would not stop until he was caught, the efforts to apprehend him were stepped up. This became the highest priority, with the most experienced investigators in the country working to apprehend the man who had been dubbed by the press as the Black Panther. A massive operation began in which all attacks on post offices were examined to see if there was a pattern. This was a huge undertaking as they sifted through reports from over 180 incidents over a 10-year period. At least 13 of the attacks were linked to the Black Panther, due to similarities in the manner of entry, the location of the property, fingerprints, bullets, and footprints that had been left at the scene. Fortunately, in these incidents, no one had come face to face with the intruder. As the investigation progressed, a poster was issued to every post office in the country with a description of the suspect and a warning to be on high alert. The post office offered to help their postmasters improve the security of their premises, especially in the winter months when the attacks seemed to have been most prevalent. But once again, the thousands of locations and the distances the perpetrator was willing to travel made tracking down leads difficult. Lancashire police focused on tracking down and eliminating anyone who had a criminal record for burglary or assault. This meant, in a time before computer databases, hours upon hours of looking through paper records. Roughly 6,000 people were questioned and eliminated. Part of the investigation considered the possibility that it could be an employee of the post office. But once again, after over 4,000 employees were interrogated, the police were no closer to apprehending the culprit. Despite over 600 police officers working on the case, looking through mountains of paperwork, knocking on thousands of doors, conducting hundreds of searches, and a substantial reward of £25,000 being offered by the post office, the Black Panther remained elusive. 1975 began, and the months ticked by with no sign of the case being cracked. As December came around, the fear was palpable. The public and police were anxious for the Black Panther to be apprehended. But through skill and good fortune, he was able to evade capture. That was until his luck began to work against him. 26-year-old PC Tony White and 29-year-old PC Stuart Mackenzie were two officers new to the police force. They were on routine patrol in Mansfield, Nottinghamshire on the 11th of December. It had been a quiet start to their shift on that cold winter's evening as they drove around the streets of the town. At 10:30 p.m. they turned onto Lake Farm Road, past the post office, where they spotted a small, wiry man scurrying by, carrying a holdall. As he passed the police car, he averted his face. His suspicious behaviour drew PC Mackenzie's attention. The officers pulled their Panda car up beside the diminutive man. They lowered the window and called him over to the vehicle. Asking the man what he was doing out so late at night, he explained he was a lorry driver who was heading home from work. When asked to open the bag he was carrying for a search, the slightly built individual obliged, unzipping the bag in a cooperative manner. But in a flash the officers found themselves staring at the barrel of a sawn-off shotgun. He forced PC Tony White into the back of the police car, but would not allow him to exit the vehicle. Instead, he demanded that the officer climb over the seats. The armed man then got into the front passenger seat. He ordered PC Mackenzie to drive, with the ominous warning, "Any tricks and you're dead," as he pressed the shotgun against the officer's ribcage. He ordered them to drive to the village of Blidworth, approximately 6 miles away, and instructed them not to look at him. PC Mackenzie explained to the gunman that they were heading in the wrong direction, and he would have to turn the car around. The gunman agreed, but once again he warned both officers. If there were any tricks, they would both be dead. Stuart Mackenzie noted that
everything that he said ended with, "Any tricks and you're dead."
The officers knew they needed to act quickly. Both of them had now realised, from the gunman's repeated warnings, who was in the car with them, and his intention was clear. He did not plan to let them live. The unarmed rookie officers complied with the gunman's demands as the car travelled along Southwell Road East, heading towards the open countryside and Sherwood Forest. Still with the gun aimed at PC Mackenzie, the abductor asked if there was any rope in the car with which he could tie them up. To which Tony said he would have a look in the back. As PC White pretended to look in the rear of the vehicle for some rope, his colleague kept asking the gunman for directions, pretending to be unsure of where they were in an effort to keep their captor occupied. The officer wanted to make the gunman feel like he was in control of the situation, while all along, Stuart was using the rearview mirror to signal to Tony. When the car approached a junction, quick-thinking Stuart Mackenzie asked the gunman which direction to take, and as the abductor glanced at the road ahead, PC Mackenzie seized his opportunity, violently turning the wheel from left to right, forcing the car to swerve. At the same time, unprepared, the gunman lowered his weapon, and Tony grabbed hold of it from the back seat, as his colleague slammed his foot on the brakes, bringing the car to an abrupt stop. A deafening sound filled the car as the gun went off. PC Mackenzie exited the car. Rolling on the floor, he struck his head on the curb and sustained minor cuts to his body. Fearing that his colleague had been killed, he got to his feet and hurried back to the car, where he found Tony struggling with the assailant, whom he held in a headlock. Between them, they dragged the man from the vehicle. They were taken aback by the strength of the little man who deftly fought against them. Stuart Mackenzie later told the Sentinel newspaper, quote, "We knocked 10 bells out of him, and I pulled him out of that car. We wrestled him to the ground. He was only 5'6", but he fought like a wild animal. He was very powerful. He was a cold-blooded killer, and he had planned to take us into Sherwood Forest and blow us away." The car had come to a stop outside a fish and chip shop, where some local miners who had just finished work were waiting for their meals. Ray Morris and Keith Wood, seeing the fight, raced to help the police. Keith, who happened to be a black belt in karate, issued a blow to the gunman's neck, and Morris grabbed hold of the assailant's wrists, allowing PC Tony White to handcuff them. Other patrons of the fish and chip shop came to assist, and seeing the wounded police officers, they began to beat the handcuffed man, only stopping when PC Mackenzie and PC White dragged the gunman to his feet and handcuffed him to some nearby railings. The bloodied and beaten officers sent out a radio broadcast for backup, before collapsing on the ground exhausted. PC Mackenzie had sustained a wound to his head, while PC White was bleeding from a gunshot wound to his hand. When other officers arrived, the gunman's bag was searched. Inside they found 2 balaclavas, dark army fatigues, and tools that could be used for breaking and entering. Despite hundreds of police officers searching for the elusive Black Panther, Britain's most wanted criminal was apprehended by 2 probationary officers, who just happened to be in the right place at the right time. PC Tony White and PC Stuart Mackenzie received a bravery award for their actions. Thanks to their courage and quick thinking, this violent offender had been captured. Ray Wagg, a detective with West Mercia Police, stated, quote, "You do what he tells you to do, otherwise you die." He was a determined man, in that anyone who challenged him died. While the gunman was held in police custody, Yorkshire Police descended on a terraced house in Bradford. First impressions of the property were that of a normal family home, which the man shared with his wife Irene and his daughter Catherine. It was only when police broke open a locked attic room door that a more sinister side to the family man was discovered. The room was a treasure trove of evidence, including guns, hoods and masks. Over 500 car ignition keys were recovered, along with combat-style clothing, hold rolls, crowbars, radios, and a Dymo tape printing machine, which will have some significance in next week's episode. And in pride of place, there stood a model of a Black Panther. Police had finally brought to an end his reign of terror. They had apprehended the Black Panther, Donald Neilson, whose crimes were notorious for their brutality and cunning. He was responsible for the deaths of 54-year-old Donald Skepper, 43-year-old Derek Aston, and 54-year-old Sidney Grayland, all of whom were well-loved members of their communities, fathers and husbands, who worked hard every day of their lives to provide for their families. The deaths of these 3 postmasters is sadly overshadowed by Donald Neilson's most notorious crime. Newspaper articles and documentaries focus on the horrific kidnap and murder of 17-year-old heiress Leslie Whittle, while Neilson's other victims become mere footnotes. I struggled to find out who these 3 men were. Most of the coverage of their cases would only give brief descriptions of what happened, and that is why I wanted to dedicate an episode solely to Donald Skepper, Derek Aston and Sidney Grayland. They lost their lives to this violent killer, leaving behind loved ones who will forever be scarred by seeing them murdered while courageously trying to protect their families. In next week's episode, I will look at who Donald Neilson was and explore the crime that made him infamous. And if you can't wait until next week, the episode will be available exclusively on Patreon. So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.